Back in 1909, a determined inventor constructed a flying contraption so fragile that every launch ended in disaster, until one freezing dawn when he soared barely 450 feet and rewrote history forever. His identity was John Moore-Brabazon, and that brief, wobbling journey established him as the first officially certified Briton to command a powered flying craft. The opening decades of the 1900s represented an epoch of tireless experimentation. The Wright siblings had demonstrated that controlled flight was achievable just years prior. Yet across Britain, aviation remained a hobby for mechanics and dreamers. John, an engineer trained at Harrow and Trinity College, Cambridge, had always felt drawn toward machinery. Before ever handling an aeroplane, he had already competed in automobile competitions at Brooklands and assembled motors during leisure hours. For him, flight wasn't entertainment. It was simply the next mechanical riddle requiring a solution. John became a member of the Aero Club of Great Britain, a modest collective of enthusiasts gathering on the Isle of Sheppey. They functioned from a rough expanse of sand called Shellbeach. The wind proved unpredictable, the terrain unforgiving, and every contraption seemed destined to collapse before leaving the ground. He constructed his own aeroplane from timber, fabric, and wire using a compact French Voisin motor. Initial attempts concluded with damaged wings and wounded pride. Yet John persisted in modifying the blueprint, strengthening connections, altering wing geometry and redistributing mass. On May 2, 1909, his determination yielded results. With Aero Club members observing, he ignited his motor, accelerated across the sand, and lifted cleanly off the surface for approximately 450 feet. A flight lasting mere seconds, yet sufficient to register the first officially documented powered flight by a British aviator. The Royal Aero Club soon initiated issuing pilot certifications. John obtained pilot license number 1, a certificate that positioned him at the dawn of British aviation heritage. It was a modest document, yet it represented revolution. Within months, the British Army's engineers started visiting Shellbeach to examine the novel flying contraptions. What they witnessed remained primitive, yet it persuaded them that aircraft could eventually assist battlefield reconnaissance. John sensed that potential instantly. He wasn't content merely with flying. He wanted to discover what flight could accomplish. What possibilities did the sky hold for warfare? By 1911, John was testing cameras attached to the fuselage of his aircraft. He wanted to capture perspectives soldiers could never obtain from ground level. Each photograph was an exercise in positioning, vibration management, and shutter synchronization. The images were unclear, yet the concept was groundbreaking. Photographs captured from the sky for military intelligence. His experiments impressed early officers of the Royal Flying Corps, and soon John was invited to participate in aerial mapping trials. Using delicate biplanes and cumbersome glass plate cameras, he and his colleagues developed the first reliable methods for capturing vertical photographs of landscape. These pictures would permit artillery units to observe enemy trenches, supply routes, and barriers with unprecedented clarity. The sky became the ultimate vantage point. At a time when aviation was considered a wealthy man's hobby, John was quietly demonstrating that flight could fulfill a strategic function. Across Europe, military interest in aviation was accelerating. Germany possessed Zeppelin airships. France was establishing dedicated reconnaissance squadrons. And Britain risked falling behind. John's early experiments at Shellbeach and later with the Royal Flying Corps helped close that gap. His conviction that cameras, not explosives, should be an aircraft's primary weapon reshaped how the Army perceived the sky. When the First World War erupted in 1914, those principles became reality. Air reconnaissance quickly proved indispensable, and the same techniques John had pioneered were adopted by entire squadrons. Yet that transformation would unfold later. In 1909, standing beside his handmade plane, John was simply an engineer with oil-stained hands and a conviction that machines could elevate man above the battlefield. Unlike many inventors of his era, John was pragmatic. He wasn't a visionary philosopher like the Wrights or a showman like Blériot. He was a mechanic who understood torque, mass, and equilibrium. His focus on practical engineering made him a quiet leader in the movement that would become the Royal Flying Corps. In later years, he would joke that his first flight was so brief he could have walked faster. But it was the genesis of everything that followed. A career that would take him from a windswept beach to the corridors of government, overseeing the very aircraft that would defend Britain decades later. By the conclusion of 1909, aviation in Britain had shifted from spectacle to science. Air races, test flights, and new manufacturers appeared across the nation. The seed John had planted at Shellbeach had begun to flourish. But for him, the real challenge was no longer how to fly. It was how to use flight to observe, to chart, and eventually to protect. That question would follow him into the First World War, where his machines would become the eyes of an army. How would cameras change modern combat? When war ignited in 1914, Britain's military aviation was still experimental. The newly formed Royal Flying Corps had fewer than 100 operational aircraft and almost no doctrine for deployment. Many generals still viewed aeroplanes as little more than distractions from traditional cavalry reconnaissance. But men like John had already glimpsed what flight could offer. A view of the battlefield no human had ever seen before. John joined the Royal Flying Corps as an officer, bringing with him not just experience but a clear purpose: to turn flight from spectacle into intelligence. He had already experimented with aerial cameras before the war, and now he set about refining those ideas under combat conditions. The challenges were immense. The cameras were large and fragile, and open-cockpit aircraft shook violently in the wind. Pilots had to lean over the edge of their planes to change glass plates while flying at low altitudes, often under enemy fire. Despite these risks, the results were revolutionary. Within months, the first sets of aerial photographs began to reveal the full layout of German trench systems. For the first time, British commanders could plan artillery bombardments based on accurate images rather than guesswork. John's early methods were soon formalized into a systematic process known as photographic reconnaissance, a field that would change warfare forever. At first, many officers doubted the reliability of these new photographs. They preferred hand-drawn maps from scouts or field observers. But as the war dragged on, the evidence became impossible to ignore. Seeing from above changed everything below. Entire enemy positions were uncovered thanks to aerial imagery. Hidden gun emplacements, ammunition dumps, and supply roads could be tracked over time. The Royal Flying Corps began assigning specific squadrons to reconnaissance duty, and John helped standardize camera mounts and lens calibrations to improve consistency. The work was meticulous and dangerous. Aircraft were slow, unarmed, and constantly targeted by German ground fire. Pilots were forced to fly straight lines at fixed altitudes to get overlapping photographs for mapping, predictable flight paths that made them easy targets. Many of the men John trained never returned. Yet the data they collected proved indispensable for planning large-scale offensives such as the Battle of the Somme in 1916. John's technical background made him an invaluable bridge between pilots and engineers. He worked with lens manufacturers, film developers, and mechanics to produce lighter cameras and faster shutters. One of his key innovations was the use of intervalometers, mechanical timers that allowed cameras to take pictures automatically at regular intervals, freeing the pilot from manually triggering each shot. This small improvement dramatically increased both safety and accuracy. By 1917, aerial reconnaissance had become one of the most important tools of the British Army. The once skeptical generals now demanded daily photo updates from the front. The Flying Corps developed techniques for stereoscopic mapping, pairing overlapping photos to create three-dimensional models of the terrain. Engineers could now calculate trench depth and elevation differences within a few feet. The war had moved into a new dimension, and John was one of the men who made that shift possible. He also understood the moral weight of what his work represented. His images weren't works of art or scientific curiosities. They were instruments of destruction. Each photo he developed meant that somewhere down the line artillery shells would fall with greater precision. He often described his work as seeing for those who cannot. And while he believed in its necessity, he knew it brought with it a heavy price. As the Royal Flying Corps expanded, John began to focus more on organization and training. He helped design instructional materials for reconnaissance pilots, emphasizing observation, discipline, and proper documentation. The objective wasn't just to take photos but to interpret them, to read the terrain like a language. The process turned pilots into analysts and cameras into extensions of military intelligence. By late 1917, the results were undeniable. British offensives were increasingly planned around photographic intelligence. Commanders could visualize enemy defenses weeks before battle. The balance of power on the Western Front was slowly shifting, not through sheer numbers but through information. John's vision of flight as the eye of the army had become reality. But the war was changing faster than anyone had anticipated. New technologies, improved anti-aircraft guns, faster fighter planes and heavier artillery, made reconnaissance flights even more dangerous. The life expectancy of a photo pilot on some fronts was measured in weeks. John's work, however, continued behind the scenes. He pushed for better coordination between air reconnaissance and ground forces, advocating for real-time communication between pilots and artillery units. His proposals led to early experiments with wireless radio in aircraft, allowing spotters to relay coordinates directly to gunners during combat. It was an extraordinary step forward, a fusion of air and ground warfare that would become standard practice in decades to come. By the end of the war in 1918, John's efforts had helped transform the airplane from a novelty into a decisive instrument of intelligence. What began as a simple curiosity on a beach in 1909 had evolved into a critical wartime discipline. Aerial photography had changed not just how battles were fought, but how they were understood. John had witnessed that transformation from the cockpit, from shaky prototypes to industrial squadrons. And though he rarely spoke about heroism, he had helped define the role of aviation in modern warfare. The war's end brought no peace of mind, only reflection. The same technology that revealed the enemy had also made destruction more precise. For John, the question that haunted him was no longer, what can flight do? But what will humanity choose to do with it next? When the Second World War broke out in 1939, John was no longer the young mechanic testing wooden aircraft on the beaches of Kent. He was now a seasoned politician serving in the British Parliament and one of the few men alive who had witnessed aviation evolve from flimsy biplanes to metal war machines. For 3 decades, he had been part of that transformation. And when Britain faced its darkest hour, Winston Churchill called on him to help save the nation's skies. John was appointed Minister of Aircraft Production in 1940 during the critical early months of the war. His task was monumental: to oversee the rapid expansion of British aircraft factories and ensure that fighter production could meet the Luftwaffe's relentless assault. The German Air Force was preparing for invasion, and Britain's survival depended on the number of planes that could take off each morning. Factories were scattered, underfunded, and struggling to keep up. Many had been converted from civilian production lines, car plants, textile mills, and workshops that had never built an aircraft before. Shortages of aluminum, machine tools, and skilled labor created daily crises. John had to manage not just numbers but morale. He approached the task as an engineer rather than a politician. He visited production sites, spoke directly to foremen, and pushed for practical changes instead of bureaucratic promises. He understood that delays on the factory floor meant lives lost in the sky. Under his leadership, output increased steadily, and within months, Britain was producing more fighters than Germany, an achievement that would prove decisive in the Battle of Britain. Churchill valued John's blunt, results-driven attitude, but their relationship was not without tension. John was known for his dry humor and independent mind, traits that didn't always fit smoothly into the strict hierarchy of wartime government. Yet Churchill recognized his worth. He once remarked that John was a man who knew both the machine and the man who built it, a rare quality among ministers. Under John's supervision, production of the Spitfire and Hurricane reached record levels. He championed collaboration between engineers, pilots, and manufacturers, what he called the triangle of air power. Every component, from engine valves to cockpit glass, was part of a national effort that included thousands of workers across Britain. Many of them women entering industrial labor for the first time. John often credited them as the silent air force, the people whose hands built what pilots would fly. He also supported experimental projects that others considered risky. Among them were early jet prototypes and advanced radar systems. Having seen firsthand how innovation had turned the tide in World War I, John believed that victory again depended on the courage to invest in untested ideas. He backed scientists like R.V. Jones and engineers at Supermarine who were pushing the boundaries of flight, speed, and detection technology. Despite his success, his tenure was not without controversy. John's outspoken manner sometimes clashed with military officials and industrial magnates. He criticized inefficiency and refused to soften his words for political comfort. In private meetings, he often reminded his colleagues that Britain's survival was a matter of arithmetic. How many planes could be built, repaired, and returned to combat in time? By 1941, his department had achieved what many thought impossible. Fighter production had not only met demand but exceeded it. The Royal Air Force was now stronger than ever, and Britain had weathered the storm of invasion. The factories John helped reorganize would go on to produce bombers, transports, and reconnaissance aircraft for the remainder of the war. But as the immediate crisis passed, politics began to shift. Churchill reorganized his cabinet, merging several ministries and redistributing responsibilities. John was moved from aircraft production to the Ministry of Transport, a quieter post far removed from the adrenaline of wartime aviation. Though he continued to serve faithfully, he knew his most important work was behind him. Still, his contributions had left a lasting mark. He had transformed an uncoordinated production system into a disciplined industrial network. The factories he helped streamline continued to serve the war effort long after his departure. Thousands of aircraft built under his oversight took part in campaigns across Europe and North Africa. Outside the war cabinet, John continued to advocate for scientific progress. He supported early research into jet propulsion, aerodynamics, and flight training reforms for post-war aviation. He believed that the technology developed in wartime should be redirected toward peaceful advancement, civil aviation, communication, and education. His engineering mind never stopped searching for better ways to connect people and ideas. As the war dragged on, John's influence faded from public attention. But within Britain's aviation circles, his reputation endured. He was remembered not as a politician but as an engineer who understood how innovation and production could decide the fate of nations. By the time victory was declared in 1945, Britain's air industry had become one of the strongest in the world. It had survived the Blitz, outproduced the enemy, and laid the groundwork for the jet age. John had been a key part of that transformation, a man who had seen flight from its first fragile steps to its role as the guardian of a nation's survival. The world he helped build was far beyond what he could have imagined in 1909. The planes that once crawled across sand now roared faster than sound. The sky he had once entered alone was now crowded with fleets of bombers, fighters, and transports. It was progress beyond measure, but also a reminder that every invention carried a cost. John never boasted about his achievements. He once said, "Machines don't win wars, men do. The machines only let them try." It was a humble acknowledgement from a man who had spent his life building both. As peace returned, he faced a different question, one that would define his legacy. How would history remember him? As the nation's first pilot or as the minister who turned flight into an instrument of war? When the war ended in 1945, Britain celebrated its victory with street parades and national pride. The names most remembered were those of generals, admirals, and politicians. Few outside of aviation circles remembered John, the man who had once taken Britain's first powered flight and later helped the nation build the aircraft that defended its skies. He stepped away from government quietly. Decades of service in both war and politics had taken their toll, and John sought a simpler life. He returned to his estate in Sussex, focusing on his two lifelong passions, engineering and the open countryside. Friends said he spent his mornings in workshops tinkering with engines and his afternoons walking the fields he had once photographed from thousands of feet above. Yet even in retirement, John remained deeply connected to aviation. He served as president of the Royal Aero Club, the same organization that had once handed him pilot's license number 1. Under his leadership, the club became a historical society dedicated to preserving the legacy of early flight. John pushed for the restoration of vintage aircraft, the creation of flight museums, and the documentation of the pioneers who had risked everything to conquer the sky. For him, it wasn't nostalgia. It was duty. He believed the early aviators had given humanity something greater than a weapon or a machine. They had given it perspective. From the air, he once said, "You realize how small the world really is and how fragile." Despite his achievements, John's name rarely appeared in post-war histories. Aviation had moved forward too quickly. Jet aircraft, guided missiles, and supersonic research dominated headlines. The pioneers of 1909 felt like distant figures from another age. Even his political role during the war was often overshadowed by the towering figure of Churchill and the engineers behind famous aircraft like the Spitfire. But those who knew the history of flight understood his importance. John had been there at the very beginning, not as a spectator but as a builder. He had bridged the gap between invention and application, between the dreamers and the strategists. He had turned flight from curiosity to cornerstone. In speeches to young pilots after the war, he often warned against losing sight of the human element in aviation. Machines will always improve, he said, but courage and curiosity will always be the first engines. In later years, John's reflections grew more philosophical. He had seen aviation bring both progress and tragedy. He had witnessed it save lives through reconnaissance and destroy cities through bombardment. His own role in that evolution weighed heavily on him. In private letters, he admitted mixed feelings about how flight had changed warfare. "We reached for the clouds," he wrote, "but found thunder." His health declined during the 1950s, but he continued to write and lecture when invited. He became an early advocate for international cooperation in air travel and safety, supporting the formation of civil aviation authorities that would later evolve into global standards for flight regulation. The same methodical thinking that had guided his wartime logistics now helped shape peacetime infrastructure. By the time of his death in 1964, John Moore-Brabazon had become a quiet legend, a man whose story was known to historians but forgotten by most. He was buried with modest ceremony, remembered simply as Britain's first licensed pilot. Yet behind that title was a lifetime of engineering, innovation, and public service. In retrospect, John's life tells the full arc of modern flight. He began as a solitary engineer building unstable wooden aircraft, then turned his passion into a wartime discipline that changed how wars were fought. Decades later, he helped oversee the machines that saved Britain from destruction, only to live long enough to see aircraft cross oceans and break the sound barrier. Few men in history had witnessed such a transformation with their own eyes. His legacy is not found in monuments or medals but in the structure of aviation itself. The idea that flight is both a tool and a responsibility. The cameras he mounted to his biplanes gave birth to reconnaissance. The production systems he built under Churchill shaped the future of defense industries. And his insistence on collaboration between engineers, pilots, and policymakers became a model for how nations organize technology during crisis. Today, his name surfaces mostly in archives and museum plaques, a footnote to the Wright brothers and the men who built Britain's Spitfires. Yet without him, the bridge between those two worlds might never have existed. He turned the theory of flight into a national instrument, not through fame but through function. John Moore-Brabazon's story reminds us that history's greatest innovators are often not those who speak the loudest but those who quietly build what others will depend upon. He built the bridge between dream and duty. He was the first Briton to lift a machine into the sky, and he spent the rest of his life ensuring that others would never fall from it. If you enjoyed learning about this forgotten pioneer, smash that like button for Winds of Thought and drop a comment below. What other unsung heroes from history should we cover next?